Hello everyone and welcome once again to the NPC Dungeon. Today I have another story prepared, but today's is going to be a little bit different than usual. As promised, I'm going to be talking about how I began the campaign that V, 57, and Piran and some other friends took part in, but I'm going to be taking a more instructional approach to this one, kind of like how I used the story about my Harengon sorcerer to illuminate some of my backstory advice, and did the same with my prison break and mystery stories. However, this time I'm going to lean a little bit more into it and try to pause at certain times and further elaborate on the points that I made last episode when I talked about how to begin a campaign, pointing out some of what I did right and some of what I did wrong and could have improved on. If you haven't seen that one, I'll link it down below. I highly recommend it. But moving on from my introductions, which have ended up being pretty long lately for some reason actually, let's start the story. So what happened? Let's start with the first step that I went over last episode. I zoomed in on each PC one by one, beginning with V, who was a changeling who started out as a merchant until a nameless stranger ruined their career. V was forced to assume a new identity, choosing to attend a magic school in the city of Soteris where the campaign began, realizing that the headmaster of this school might know something about the identity of the person who ruined their life. But they had to complete a mission first before being granted an audience with her, a mission that would be given to them by a gnome named Alton Highcraft, an artificer employed by the university. I tracked this character walking through campus, describing the sights of the world until they arrived at the center of the city, a square of bustling activity and an overhead bridge. I'm sure you can already see my first mistake. I just kind of described the character walking with no real interactions or encounters or anything along the way. I repeated this mistake twice as two of my other players rode into the city by boat. They didn't have a combined backstory or anything, they were just kind of in the same place at the same time. One came to visit the university in search of maps she heard about that they had in order to hunt down an elusive magic item of immense power that she had heard about, while the other sought vengeance against a noble who had so wronged him in the past. The first place he thought he should look the center of town, where the university just happened to be. After the two realized they were traveling together in the same direction, introductions were made, and they continued on. Meanwhile, everyone's favorite Blue Ooze 57 was sitting in his rundown apartment, which doubled as his office. He was something of a detective, and was about to get his next case as a knock sounded against the door. A half-orc opened it and introduced himself as the husband of the groundskeeper of the university. She'd gone missing while collecting reagents from the wilderness west of the city, and it was 57's job to go and find her. First obvious place to look, the university where she worked. Soteris was a tall city, built up rather than out, in which elevators were the only way to reach the higher sections of the city. 57 came across the other two I just mentioned in one such elevator along the way. A few fun character interactions were made here, as one remained rather standoffish, and 57 poked and prodded at them, trying to get to know them better. And now, obviously, yes, I allowed 57 to have some character action with the NPC who gave him the job he's supposed to do, but like I said before, I didn't do this with anyone else. However, the time in the elevator did allow for some roleplay and character interaction, but I do wish I brought all of the characters together at once rather than piecemeal like this. Anyway, it wasn't long before they arrived at the front of the school, where V already was, hidden in the crowd. A great bridge loomed overhead, lined with gargoyles. One of them, however, was more than just a statue. It sprang to life and swooped down into the crowd below. If it isn't already clear, I'm using the approach that I outlined last episode, where I combined the characters meeting with the combat encounter, and I believed it worked to great effect. I described the people running in fear as my players took on the role of action movie superheroes battling this evil. However, I will say that I wish I made this combat encounter more obviously related to the story. I mean, it was related to the story. The Gargoyle was a spy sent as sentry over the secret research conducted at the university by the very individual who had ran V out of a job in favor of funding his own secret projects, and maybe that was fine. I'm sure there are some groups that don't care how story-driven a random combat encounter is, but the combat itself was still interesting. The Gargoyle controlled two magical flying swords, one of which 57 grappled onto. Flying above the Gargoyle to drop down on him as he bit a chunk out of V's shoulder. V tried Eldritch blasting him, but to no avail, as another player jumped on his back and tackled him to get him out of the way. V banged on the outside door to Highcraft's office until the door flew open, revealing an old gnome with a strange contraption on his hand, a gauntlet that shot out an electric bolt at the Gargoyle, causing him to fly away. I probably could have balanced that combat a little bit better, but wait for a future episode for me to talk about balancing combat. And speaking of combat episodes, that part of the encounter where 57 tried to grab onto the flying sword should seem familiar to the more loyal of my viewers. I used it as an example of player creativity in my first episode on combat. My players went inside and saw Professor Highcraft, who gave V the mission he had in mind. If you're curious, it was to go to an ettercap den west of the city to discover why ettercaps had been running rampant. He also agreed to share whatever information on maps and magical artifacts he had to the player who wanted such if she agreed to help. The last agreed out of the goodness of his heart. Another error of mine, I didn't provide a motivation for everyone, but 57 was headed in that direction anyway, so the more people he had to protect him, the better. Here they talked and discussed and negotiated appreciated. A few of them even tried to throw Highcraft's little automaton robot buddy companion into a grate outside, which made for some fun interactions. Then they went their own separate ways for the night, one of my players sleeping in the marketplace as he was used to living in the wilderness and was not quite accustomed to city life. And then they all reconvened in the morning, where during the next session they headed for the dock and left the city. Part sounded familiar as well. It also should, as it marks the beginning of the story of Bach, which I've also told on this channel before. By the way, links to all the episodes that I mentioned here will be in the description if you're curious. And that's it for this week's story. I know it was kind of different from my usual style, and it wasn't super long, but I hope you still enjoyed it. Feel free to watch this week's other episode where I talk about how to begin a campaign, and come back next Friday where I'll talk about how to end a campaign, and on Saturday where I'll get back to the story series that I started a few weeks ago. Thanks for watching, and until next time, let's learn something.